805 Focus. I'm Dr. Cynder Sinclair with Nonprofit Connect, and we will be bringing you the latest on your favorite nonprofits. So get ready to be inspired. Our special guest today is James Joyce III, and James is founder and chief visionary officer of Coffee with a Black Guy. Welcome, James.
Thanks so much, Cynder, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh gosh, I'm so glad you found the time to be with us. And I'm fascinated to hear all about what you're doing with your organization, right. Coffee with a Black Guy. And I have a lot of other questions too, but how about if we just start there?
Sure. So Coffee with the Black Guy, real briefly, I started it back in 2016 as just kind of a passion project. In short, Black Guy office hours. There was a lot of stuff that was going on in our country that folks were feeling some kind of way about and not really sure how to talk through or walk through some of this discomfort. Mm-hmm. And so I basically laid it out to have these Black Guy office hours to be able to help our community kind of see through some of these things, talk through some of these things, and hopefully some answers to the questions that are out there are there. Not the answer, but some answers, right? And so right now where I'm at is that's transitioned over the years to still have that basic premise, but I've branched out into being more specific in cultivating cultures for organizations, corporations, things like that through consulting and coaching.
Okay, so now a part of that is the consulting and coaching.
Yes.
So tell me how that works. Who are your clients?
Sure. Well, I've worked with several nonprofits. Nonprofit boards will bring me in to facilitate a conversation with their board about, okay, what are we doing to invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues? Uh-huh. How are we dealing with these things? We're talking through issues of anti-Blackness, privilege, race. How do we move forward through this as an organization? Nonprofits, schools, small church groups, corporations, a variety of organizations who are interested in advancing their thought process, their actions in the diversity, equity, inclusion, commonly known as DEI.
So, all right, so you go around to different nonprofit boards, typically the boards, right, to make a presentation, have a conversation about DEI or something like that. Do you ever get into difficult conversations, or are all the board members like, oh boy, James is here, and we're just so glad to see you? And
the crux of what I do is about those difficult conversations. Yeah. And so if it's all warm and fuzzy, that's probably the wrong place for me to be, right? I want to be in the places that are uncomfortable because that's where growth happens, right? And my idea is about change. How are we going to get folks to change their perspective, which informs their actions, right? And so when I'm going into an organization or working even with a family, right? I've had families invite me to deal with specific issues. When I'm going to work with groups or individuals, it's really about, okay, what's the end goal? How can we move us together collectively forward, right? It's not an individual thing, it's not a shame thing, it's not a point the finger thing, but it is really genuinely a community thing.
So when you have those conversations with boards, boards are comprised of all kinds of people.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine some of them are, gung-ho, yep, let's talk about DEI and all that. But maybe there's some that object, or so you end up being right in the middle of a difficult conversation. How do you keep your cool and still address everyone's perspective in the room?
So these issues of race, the reason I felt comfortable and confident enough to start Coffee with the Black Guy is because I've had to deal with race since I was a kindergartner, right? Then I would be angry, right? In the early years, I would be angry, lash out, get in trouble in school because I'm always dealing with these quote unquote microaggressions or these various other elements that would happen, like being the only black kid in class when the slavery topic comes up and everyone turns and says, well, what do you think? Well, why do I have to think anything? I'm a student here, I'm not the teacher, right? And so where are we going with this conversation? Then I was angry about it. But as you develop and go through these things, you realize, okay, look, it happens way too many times to continually be angry, and I can't live in anger, right? Like that's not a good place for me. It's not a good place for the community, right? And so to be at a developmental space, I've had board members say that they don't want to be shamed into feeling like they should be guilty because they're white. Well, that's not what the conversation is about, but I'm happy to talk about that issue because you brought it up already, right? Because there's something there. And it's, again, not a shame, not a blame, but it's really about how can we develop through that? Why do you think that's what this is, right? Just because it's coffee with the black guy and the perspective is not the dominant perspective in society, which is generally known as white male, right? Like that's the norm in our society. And so when we approach things from what is perceived as the other, it's gonna make people feel uncomfortable, but nothing grows without a little discomfort.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Maryland, right outside of Baltimore. So technically the South, the Mason-Dixon state. And so growing up, there were conversations and leading protests in school against why are these kids allowed to wear the Confederate flag on their T-shirt to school and have it in their car, flying the flag from their car that sits in the parking lot that I have to walk past. That war was over and we lost. That was me in high school, right? And so I've always kind of had that in me by necessity or otherwise.
Yeah. So how old were you, or what were the circumstances when you decided I can't live by being angry all the time?
Oh, jeez. That was, I'm sure, an evolution. There was no one specific instant, but I think that let me kind of the beginning of that was I'd have to credit that to my elementary school guidance counselor, Richard Ebersol. Rest in peace. He just passed away a few months ago. But there was this point where I was seen as acting out in school, being insubordinate. I knew that word in elementary school. Being insubordinate, challenging authority, all of these things. And he would work with me and transition my collection from Garbage Pail Kids to baseball cards. And just something simple of that is saying, like, hey, these Garbage Pail Kids, now that I don't know if you recall what they are, but they're a bit, I don't know, demonic for lack of a better word. And to transition my mindset from that to something more productive. And that was just an early step in getting me to do that on a more regular basis. Now, I probably figured it out in my adulthood, but planting those early seeds set the foundation for that.
Yeah, so he planted the seeds and he sort of showed the way, demonstrated here's what you do, but here's how you do it.
Yeah. And there were several instances for me like that, like a pivotal moment. Looking also back at elementary school, there was an art teacher. I had a black male art teacher. How influential is that, right?
Wow.
But when we learned about the color wheel, he explained how the color black is the inclusion of all colors. And to have him explain that to a young, impressionable black boy, oh my gosh. That was a weight that you're right, being black does include all colors. And now that is my responsibility.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. So I read a fascinating article you wrote for Red Canary magazine, which I think I'm going to subscribe to because, boy, that sounds interesting.
It's a great organization.
And so I'm going to read, I wrote this down because I was so impressed with it. So you talk about convening uncomfortable conversations about race. And so, maybe you can give us some more examples about how you do that. That's your work. That's what you do.
That's at the crux of what Coffee with the Black Guy is. It's about sharing that perspective from others, right? And so when we enter the room and we bring folks in, whether that be for an organization who says, okay, well, we want to bring you in to help with our professional development for our employees, or it's an event that I'm hosting for the community where I say, hey, I'm going to be here at this location at this time. Let's come talk about these issues. However it is, we're going to get into a conversation about race because It's coffee with a black guy, right? How can you not?
Right.
In the name, that concept is there to be able to help folks start that conversation. For those who are really uncomfortable, one of the early questions is, well, what kind of coffee do you drink, right? Simple, seems benign, but I can utilize that to get in a conversation about race. How? Go research the history of coffee and where it originated.
Oh.
That's a challenge to anybody. Go research that and find out the history of where coffee originated. And you'll see why we can kind of talk about race directly from that. A small hint in the upper eastern part of Africa, near Ethiopia.
Oh, well, it shows you how much I don't know. Golly.
Yeah.
That would be fascinating itself. We'll do this again, and I want to hear all about it.
Just giving a small taste right there.
So, so I see in the newspapers and hear people bat around this phrase, CRT, critical race theory, and I bet you hear that as well. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. No, I did talk about that briefly in the article. Is how I was,
Yes.
campaigning for mayor for Santa Barbara, and someone asked me about CRT as I show up to someone else's door, and it happened multiple times. For me, CRT is not a new argument. Critical race theory. It's generally a topic that's discussed and taught in law schools, right? When we really talk about what critical race theory is, but what it's being conflated to mean is any talk about the totality of the truth, right? And so if we talk about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and doing all of this stuff, we should also be talking about the dentures in his mouth that were the teeth of slaves, right? And saying that, okay, that doesn't disqualify him from being a founding father, but it gives you a full picture of, okay, that was acceptable at the time. That was the thing. So why would we not talk about that? That is indeed history, right? And so when I look at the conversation against critical race theory or actual truth that are happening in some other states in our nation, I think back to Santa Barbara. Several years in the shortly after 2010, there started to be this movement around ethnic studies now. And when you saw how that was vehemently opposed by a small group of folks in our community and the strategies that they utilized to oppose it, that's the playbook, the exact same playbook that's being used across the country to combat quote unquote CRT.
Wow.
Yeah. So I've long said that Santa Barbara is a petri dish, right?
Yeah.
You can try small things here, for good or bad, right? Like they can try the exact playbook that's being utilized here in Santa Barbara to see how it plays out. I can start something like a coffee with the black guy to see, is there an appetite for folks to address these issues? Reminding you, I started that in 2016.
You started it in 2016, okay.
And then everyone woke up post George Floyd in 2020. And everyone wanted to have those conversations then. Well, I had already had a track record of doing that. We had already been doing that in the Santa Barbara area at a small scale, but that's scalable, those conversations. And what do you get from a conversation? A conversation changes a perspective, and that change in perspective can inform your actions. How are you gonna act as a board member? How are you gonna vote as a board member? As a staff member who oversees a budget for a company, and you say you're investing in DEI, how are you spending that money? What are you spending it on? Those are the tough conversations.
Yeah. So 2016 you started, what was your rationale? What was your thinking in starting that? I mean, obviously we know what you wanted to accomplish, but how did you think of it then in 2016? And yeah, anyway, talk about that.
I thought of it a little bit before then because I had already had the domain name, I had already thought through it, and I learned about it by having an argument with a fraternity brother of mine who was adamant that I was asking him about some programs that he had started, and he says, when he was working in the city administrator's office in Hawthorne at the time, he said, well, we started Coffee with a Cop. And I said, no, we've got that in Santa Barbara, I've seen it in Ventura, that's everywhere, what are you talking about? I did my research, and Hawthorne, California was the birth of Coffee with a Cop in 2011. And when they started that, law enforcement wanted to be seen beyond the badge and humanize the uniform. And to hear that, I said, you know what? Me too. I can't take my uniform off, but let's have conversation about what that means for me, how my worldview is shaped by my skin color, right? That's a real thing. And so the birth was there. And then in 2016, that summer, there was a Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, were the names that we heard about black men being killed by law enforcement or those deputized to believe that they are. And I just couldn't be at home weeping anymore. Every time those stories come up, I remember incident upon incident upon incident where I've been stopped for driving while black, or have had encounters with law enforcement because of X, Y, Z. That is a real thing. That has been my experience. But to counterbalance that experience, I've also had a lot of positive experiences with law enforcement. And so I don't necessarily other them, their perspective. I can understand some of it, but it's worth having a conversation, which is what I'm absolutely willing to do.
So now fast forward a little bit, George Floyd, all that situation, how did that impact your organization? And you, for that matter.
Well, I mean, you can't talk about the impact of George Floyd without the reality of COVID, right? I don't think that America would have been, quote unquote, awoken to those realities had we not already watched The Tiger King, already seen everything on all of the platforms, and kind of were at this point during COVID, like, all right, we're bored. Nowhere else to look, couldn't really go outside, and then we see this horrific reality for many people that's broadcast on our television. For me, was it a surprise? Not necessarily. I think the surprise came from the response, because it wasn't a new thing, right? I mean, we've seen black men killed by law enforcement before. We've known that it's happened. If anybody listens to any music that's done by black folks, you hear that story time and time again. And so to say that, wow, I didn't know, there was a bit of willful ignorance. I think what George Floyd brought was this inability to say, okay, I can no longer be ignorant. I see this in high definition. And so for me, it was really an alignment of purpose. I had just started to pivot Coffee with the Black Guy to do the online platform, right? And so initially when I started, it was to we got to bridge that interpersonal divide. We need to break down talking behind our keyboards and talk to folks face. It's really difficult to hate someone face to face when you're not in the red zone already, right? If you sit down and have a conversation with someone, it's very difficult to hate that way. And so that was the premise of it. And so once we started to pivot and say, okay, we're gonna be online, there was this fear of people Zoom bombing, and it never materialized, thankfully. But that fear was absolutely there. And so by the time the world woke up and saw George Floyd, I had been having conversations. I had had a proven model that works. I thought through what are some guidelines that can keep us in bounds as we have these conversations, and they had worked. And so to be able to transition that to an online platform, I hate to use the word seamless, but it was almost seamless to be able to make that transition, to be ready to help convene conversations. And the benefit of being able to do that on an online platform is it brought folks to the conversation from around the country and from other countries occasionally as well.
So now that that's over and we don't have to, quote unquote, be online, do you still do some work online for the benefit of people that are far away?
I do. And it works better for some organizations' budgets to be able to say, look, we don't have to fly you out, put you in a hotel or all of that stuff. Right. We can bring you in, do something online. It's more affordable. For me, I think the impact is not quite the same, but we can achieve a good level of shared understanding on an online platform.
Wow. Okay. Now, all right. So I'm looking to see what else I read in your fabulous article. And it said that you found out something about yourself. You found out that you were not drawn, I find this interesting the way you put it, you were not drawn to comfortability.
Yeah.
Comfortability. That you enjoy overcoming obstacles or solving a challenge instead, and actually leaning into personal discomfort. That's rare. Do you get that that's rare?
Not necessarily, right? Because I based that largely, and I came to that understanding through sports.
Oh.
I was a track athlete,
Oh.
and I ran hurdles. And yeah, I could sprint, yeah, I could high jump, but I felt alive when I'm running hurdles. Predominantly the 400-meter hurdles I ran at Ohio University. And so in doing that, you're overcoming 10 obstacles within the race. And the object is to see how fast you can traverse that track and those 10 obstacles. Not around the obstacles, but you have to learn to penetrate those obstacles. And so that whole idea of leaning into that discomfort, yeah, occasionally you hit your knees, you stumble, things like that. It can be painful, but you don't stop. Right? And so what I realize is, as a person, when things are just hunky-dory and all good in my life, I get bored.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And so to be able to overcome things, to be able to have challenges, to set an obstacle and overcome it, and then an obstacle and overcome it, there's a rhythm to that. And that's the rhythm that makes me feel alive.
And so, but you made that connection between the track and your everyday life.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not sure a lot of people can do that, so good for you.
Well.
So now, let's just quickly talk about the mayor's race. You came in second, 2021, and what was that like for you?
You know, it was a culmination of a decade of public service. I had worked for other elected officials, the state assembly member, the state senator, Hannibal Jackson, who represented the area at the time. And I had been in the know, been in the rooms, hearing the conversations throughout the district between the Camarillo grade and the San Luis Obispo County line in Santa Barbara County. And so much larger than Santa Barbara. So I'm like, I've got this skill set, this knowledge, this access. It would be a shame to have it go to waste. So let me at least put this offering on the table to be of service in one last hurrah for the city of Santa Barbara. Because, I mean, it's just a beautiful city, right?
That's great.
And so that was kind of what that impetus behind that was. I'd never aspired to be an elected official. I never, wanted to be quote unquote a politician, although I do see a very distinct difference between politician and public servant.
Yes.
I think we're blessed with solid and quality public servants in our region, not necessarily as many skilled politicians.
Yeah. Wow. So, can you think of a pivotal experience in your life and just tell us about that?
Well, there have been many, but I think what we talked about a little bit about the realization with the hurdles and understanding who I am. Yeah. Once you start to have an understanding of who you are and how you're made up, it allows you to present in the world in a much more authentic way. In the evolution of that, I realized that I am my story. Right? I am my story. So I am a compilation of my experiences, the many times I've had to encounter law enforcement, on a negative front, the many times my mom would tell me before I leave the house, be careful who you hang with, bullets don't have names, these kind of things. And it's like, why are you saying this? Understanding how they make up who I am allowed me to present in the world in a much more authentic way.
Wow. Now, okay, one last question here.
Sure.
So you are, you meaning Coffee with a Black Guy organization, your organization is not really a 501c3, and yet I notice on your website you accept donations, so you're a LLC. Can you just talk briefly about that?
Well, being a former journalist, I understand the definition of donate, and it does not require that you be a C3 in order to donate.
Yep.
It is giving a gift, right? And this is a movement. Right? A movement of better understanding.
Yeah.
And you're going to value it differently than you would a nonprofit. Churches are nonprofits, and they have historically been, right?
Yep.
And folks tithe and they give money to their churches, and there may or may not be a strong connection to that. Well, this is a movement that you can invest in, right? It is a movement that you can help our community move forward with. And so the concept is you're gonna value it in a different way. And think about this, as I'm working with organizations and they bring me in, it's gonna feel different if they're engaging this as a budget item that they can write off on their taxes versus if it's a thing that they're gonna genuinely invest in. And so at the end of Coffee with the Black Guy conversations, like, yeah, I have a basic recommendation, right? It's get comfortable being uncomfortable. That's the start. Once you get comfortable being uncomfortable, that informs your actions, as I said. So once you are uncomfortable, then once you know better, do better, right? Have that uncomfortability, that new informed perspective, inform how you present in the world. And then finally, invest in the things you say you care about. If you say that you care about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you don't have a budget line item that you're investing in that in, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
Right? And so that concept is very much rooted into the foundation of what Coffee with the Black Guy is. And no secret being kept, I'm a reparationist, right? And so reparations may or may not become a reality for Black Americans, those who are descendants of the enslaved in our country. However, this concept of creating a business, that is an opportunity to get some of that back. Right?
Yeah.
And it's a social enterprise because not only am I getting, but it's primarily giving.
Yes.
It is a public service to convene these conversations.
So when people donate, really, that helps you go to Santa Barbara nonprofits and other businesses and families and all that, but also other places as well, and really talk about DEI and other topics like that. And it helps you. It helps you with all the work that you're doing with Coffee with the Black Guy.
Absolutely. And my job isn't to solve racism. Like, yeah, it says the goal of Coffee with the Black Guy is to put an end to racism, but I have no fear of being out of business anytime soon, right? So we're going to still be having these conversations, but the goal and the concept behind it is planting the seed, right? As I said, get comfortable being uncomfortable. So a flower that's beautiful like this, we love to see it, we love to smell it. But do we like to watch that whole journey that it took from being a bulb?
Oh gosh.
Right? That's an uncomfortable act to start as a bulb and then have to crack open and then get the nutrients that you need through that process and then start to unfold these green leaves. They're not that pretty, right? And so as you're doing that, right, that's the journey that we're going through. And it doesn't happen without that uncomfortability. And then when we finally get to the thing that we appreciate, the beauty, the smell, the opulence, that's the goal, right? And so this journey of better racial understanding is genuine, like it's about being a flower.
Yeah. And so that's a great message for everybody to learn how to be comfortable with uncomfortability.
Yeah. Because I've had to do that. As a Black man in America, I've started having conversations about race in kindergarten, right? As that racial element presents itself to a young child, right? And so after the years, you go through a journey, you figure out, okay, what works, what doesn't work. I'm angry, I'm not angry. I've learned how to cope. I've learned how to direct my anger in a more productive and developmental way. Let's have the conversation.
Well, I tell you, my hat's off to you. Here you grew up in this soup of adversity, and yet you have been able to and continue to be able to translate that into just this beautiful work that blesses everyone.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and as we say in the work, onwards, because it continues. Yeah. It continues with each one conversation.
Well, thank you for all your good work, James.
Thank you,
and for being on our show to share it with everyone.
Well, thank you for having me and for doing this great work in the 805, because I have lived other places in the country, and I definitely believe the 805 is a gem that not a lot of folks know about.
Yeah, we are pretty
Which
lucky.
I'm okay with, to one extent.
Well, thanks again, and thank you for joining us on 805 Focus, and we'll see you next time.